So I've been sitting here for the past, I don't know, hour and a half maybe, just going down a rabbit hole about the MCU, and I thought, well, if I'm going to be doing this anyway, I might as well put it on. Because this is exactly the kind of thing that I find genuinely soothing. Just quietly picking apart a fictional universe that I've spent an embarrassing amount of time thinking about. No pressure, no destination really, just 100 theories, laid out one after another, some small, some enormous, and all of them at least a little bit interesting. A quick word before we get into it. If you enjoy these long-form videos and you want to make sure you catch the ones I've got coming up, subscribing does help. There's a whole series of these planned, but honestly, no pressure on that right now. You're here to relax. Now, the MCU, 20-something films, a growing stack of television series, and more lore than any reasonable person could be expected to hold in their head at any given time. Which is part of what makes it so endlessly rewarding to pick apart. The writers and directors have spent over 15 years hiding things in plain sight. Connections that span films that came out a decade apart. Character details that only make sense on a rewatch. Theories that started as wild speculation and then quietly, without any announcement, turned out to be basically right. That's what we're going through tonight. 100 of them. Some of these are theories that have been circulating in forums and subreddits for years. Some of them are a bit more obscure. A few of them I genuinely think are correct, and I'll tell you when that is. And a few of them I think are a bit of a stretch, and I'll tell you that too, because half the fun is the conversation around whether something holds up. We're going to drift through a lot of different corners of the MCU. Tony Stark and Hydra and Loki and the Asgardians and Wanda and everything, Doctor Strange. We'll end up in the cosmic end of things, which is where I always end up when I start pulling on these threads. The Guardians, the Eternals, the snap, and what it actually did. All of it. There's no real order you need to follow here. Each section is its own little world. If you're asleep before we reach the Wanda section, that's fine. If you come back in somewhere around the cosmic theories, that's fine too. Nothing here depends on what came before it in a way that requires your full attention. Right. Let's get into it. Iron Man is the one that started all of this. The 2008 film that, at the time, genuinely nobody expected to work as well as it did. Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark turned out to be one of those casting decisions that reframes what a franchise can be. And because of that, Tony Stark became the character that the entire MCU was quietly built around. Which means he's also the character with the most theories attached to him. Not all of them are equal. Some are a bit obvious in hindsight. But there are a few in this section that I find genuinely compelling. And one or two that I think are probably right in a way the film sort of confirmed without ever stating outright. This one has been around since Avengers. Endgame came out in 2019, and it's never really gone away, because the evidence for it keeps looking more interesting the more you examine it. Here's the core of the theory. At the very end of Endgame, after Tony's funeral, his daughter Morgan is approached by a holographic recording of Tony, the kind he pre-recorded as a message for her. Standard enough. He says he loves her 3000. The recording ends and everyone cries, and that's more or less it. Except the hologram turns to face Morgan at her exact position. Not toward where the camera was pointing when the message was recorded, toward where she's actually standing in that room, in that moment. A pre-recorded hologram doesn't have the ability to track a person in real time and adjust its facing. That's not how recordings work, but a live AI, one that has awareness that can perceive its environment, could do exactly that. In the comics, when Tony Stark died, his consciousness had already been backed up into his AI systems. His body died, but a version of him persisted digitally. The MCU has always had a looser relationship with the comics than people assume, but it does borrow this kind of structural beat when it serves the story. And the hologram detail is too specific to be an accident. Filmmakers at that level of production don't leave something like that in the shot by mistake. They knew what they were doing. The theory goes further too. Friday, Tony's AI, would have had years of access to Tony's cognitive patterns, his decision-making, his voice, his emotional responses. The raw material for a personality upload would have been sitting there the entire time. And given that Tony spent significant portions of Iron Man 3 and the years after it in quiet dread about a threat he couldn't fully prepare for, it's not outside his character to have thought about contingencies. That's what Tony does. He builds things before he needs them. He solves problems 3 steps ahead of when they become problems. I'm not saying Tony is secretly alive. I'm saying there's a version of Tony that persists somewhere in the system. And the filmmakers placed a very specific detail in that final scene to make sure you noticed. The recruitment scene in Civil War is one of those moments that feels so effortlessly natural that it's easy to miss how unnaturally precise it is. Tony Stark shows up at the apartment of a 15-year-old in Queens with a specific cover story, a specific read on Peter's psychology, and a specific understanding of the timeline he's working with. He knows about the homemade suit. He knows about the web fluid. He knows Peter's been operating for 6 months. This isn't intelligence gathered over a weekend. There's a long-running theory that the kid in Iron Man 2, the small boy at the Stark Expo, wearing a toy Iron Man mask, who raises his hand toward one of the hammer drones before Tony swoops in to neutralize it, is Peter Parker. The timing fits. The location fits. Queens to the Flushing Meadows site of the expo is a completely plausible distance for a kid to travel with a parent. And the age lines up for who Peter would have been in 2010 relative to his age in 2016. Tony would have remembered that kid. Not necessarily at the time, but later, when he started looking for him. When you're assembling intelligence on a teenage superhero operating out of Queens and you're cross-referencing old S.H.I.E.L.D. surveillance files and expo attendance records and Friday's facial recognition database, a kid who stood up to a combat drone at age 8 and didn't run is the kind of data point that sticks out. Tony's line in Civil War, "I looked for you," carries more weight if the looking started before Spider-Man ever appeared. And the reason this matters, beyond being a nice bit of connective tissue, is that it reframes Tony's mentorship of Peter. It's not just affection and a bit of recognizing his younger self. Tony felt a specific debt to that kid. He put that kid in danger by having the expo, and a decade later he recruited him into a world that was significantly more dangerous than a rogue drone at a science fair. The guilt thread that runs through Tony's relationship with Peter has roots that go further back than Homecoming suggests. This one is actually one of the cleaner theories in this whole list because the film almost confirms it without quite saying it. In Civil War, Tony demonstrates BARF, Binary Augmented Retroframing, at MIT. It's a technology that projects fully immersive holographic memory reconstructions, stunningly sophisticated. At the time, it reads as a character beat, a glimpse into Tony's grief about his parents. And then the plot moves on. Then in Spider-Man, Far From Home, Mysterio's entire operation is revealed to be built on exactly this kind of technology. Immersive projections, environmental illusions, large-scale holographic fabrication. The infrastructure of Quentin Beck's villain plan is, at its core, BARF applied to warfare. Beck and his crew are confirmed to be former Stark Industries employees who were let go or sidelined. Beck in particular is explicitly described as a gifted holographic engineer who contributed significantly to Stark's work and received essentially no credit, which means he was there when BARF was being developed. He either worked on it directly or was close enough to the team that he understood the technology's architecture. And when he was pushed out, he took that understanding with him. This theory recontextualizes Tony Stark as someone who, entirely without meaning to, handed his eventual enemy the weapon that would be used to destroy his protégé's life. Tony's BARF technology, built to process grief, to revisit the past, to reconstruct memory, became the tool Mysterio used to fabricate an entire false history for himself and nearly destroy Peter Parker. There's something genuinely tragic about that chain of cause and effect that the films never stop to fully articulate. In Iron Man 2, Tony is dying. The palladium core of the arc reactor is slowly poisoning him, and he can't find a new element to replace it. The solution turns out to be hiding in the model of the 1974 Stark Expo that Howard built, the atomic structure of a new element encoded in the architecture of the layout. The official framing of this is that Howard discovered something extraordinary, but didn't have the technology to synthesize it, so he left the information behind for Tony to find. Which is touching. But the theory is that this wasn't just record keeping. It was a specifically targeted message, engineered for Tony's particular brain. Howard Stark spent his life working alongside people who were using and developing technology that suggested future threats. He knew about the Tesseract. He spent years working on problems adjacent to cosmic-level energy. A man with that access and that intelligence, looking at the world his son was going to inherit, and understanding something about what kind of man Tony would become, would have thought about contingencies. The way the element is hidden, not in a document, not in a lab note, but in a spatial puzzle that requires both scientific literacy and the particular lateral thinking that Tony is specifically good at, suggests someone who knew their audience. It's a small theory in some ways, but the version of Howard Stark it implies is much more interesting than the cold, distant father Tony describes. Someone who knew he wouldn't be there, thought hard about what Tony would need, and built the answer into something Tony would eventually look at. Iron Man 3 ends with Tony removing the extremist virus from Pepper after her exposure during the Aldrich-Killian confrontation. The surgery is presented as a complete cure. Clean removal, problem solved, except extremis, in the MCU's framing, is a biological re-engineering of the human body at a cellular level. Killian's version of it was unstable, prone to overheating and explosive decompression. But Pepper's exposure was brief and her body stabilized before removal. The argument is that a complete cellular removal of something that thorough isn't really possible. What Tony removed was the active, unstable expression of the virus. What stayed behind was a trace biological imprint at the cellular level. The evidence people point to is her performance in Endgame. Pepper put on the rescue armor for the first time, essentially, and adapted to it with a speed and physical competence that's genuinely unusual. Tony had years to learn how to fight in the suits. Pepper had, narratively, very little lead time. Her combat in the final battle is fluid and assured in a way that suggests her body was doing something the suit alone doesn't explain. There's also a smaller piece of evidence from Far From Home, where Happy and Pepper are both present, and Pepper is described as running Stark Industries with a competence that goes well beyond just being good at her job. She's sharp, she's fast, and she seems to operate at a level of physical and mental performance that the trace extremist theory would account for. Nothing confirmed, nothing denied, just a quiet possibility sitting in the background. The abduction of Tony Stark in Iron Man 1 is presented as opportunistic. He's in Afghanistan demonstrating a weapon system, and a terrorist organization captures him. Clean and simple. Except the Ten Rings, as we eventually learn, is a 1,000-year-old global organization with extraordinary reach and resources. The idea that they were simply in the right place at the right time strains credulity somewhat. The theory, and this one has been around since roughly 2013, is that the Ten Rings had been watching Stark Industries specifically for years, waiting for the right moment and the right leverage, not just for the Jericho missile, but for Stark himself. Shang-Chi and the legend of the Ten Rings confirms just how old and sophisticated the organization actually is, with Wenwu having operated across centuries. A group with that longevity and that level of operational sophistication doesn't improvise a kidnapping of the world's most prominent weapons manufacturer. They plan it. And the fact that their demand was for Tony to build them a weapon he'd already built suggests they had detailed technical intelligence about Stark Industries' actual capabilities, which isn't publicly available information. Someone was feeding the 10 Rings information. Whether that person was inside Stark Industries or inside the government contracts network is the part the theory doesn't fully resolve. But the abduction wasn't random. It was planned, it was resourced, and it was a long time coming. Justin Hammer got arrested. He didn't get killed. That distinction matters more than the films have ever directly acknowledged. Hammer Industries didn't cease to exist when its CEO was imprisoned. Organizations that size have boards, contracts, government relationships, and a catalogue of partially developed weapons technology that doesn't just disappear because the man at the top went to jail. The theory is that Hammer Industries' technology, specifically the suit designs and weapons systems that Hammer developed in his pursuit of Stark-level tech, has been quietly feeding into the black market and into various villain operations throughout the MCU. The suit designs shown in Iron Man 2, while inferior to Stark's, are still extraordinarily advanced compared to anything else in the world. That technology was somewhere. Someone was maintaining it, someone was selling it, and the trail leads to corners of the MCU that nobody's bothered to follow. This one is more of a background theory than a plot-relevant one. It's less about what it changes and more about what it fills in. A lot of minor villains throughout the MCU have access to weapons technology that shouldn't really be at that level. The Hammer Industries theory is one of the tidier explanations for where that comes from. This one is small, but I find it genuinely interesting because it asks you to rewatch Iron Man 2 as something closer to a tragedy than a comedy of errors. Tony's behaviour in that film, the recklessness, the party, the driving the Formula One car, the conflict with Rhodey, is consistently read as Tony being Tony, arrogant, self-destructive, unable to deal with mortality. But palladium poisoning is a neurological event, not just a physical one. Heavy metal accumulation in the bloodstream affects cognition, emotional regulation, and decision-making in ways that map almost exactly onto what we see Tony doing. He wasn't just being reckless, he was impaired. The dramatic irony of it is that nobody around him noticed because his baseline behaviour was already read as erratic. The poison was able to do its work undetected because everyone had already calibrated their expectations of Tony to include erratic behaviour. It doesn't change the arc of the film, but it recolours every scene he's in. The moments that read as funny read differently if you understand that the person doing those things is operating under cognitive impairment rather than unchecked ego. Tony's genius is real and undisputed within the fiction of the MCU. But the arc reactor, particularly the miniaturized one he built in a cave, has always been slightly improbable from a pure engineering standpoint. A device that generates clean energy at that level from materials available in a weapons depot is, at minimum, suspiciously efficient. The theory is that Howard Stark, through his work on the Tesseract in the 1940s and his subsequent access to S.H.I.E.L.'s classified salvage programs, had exposure to energy technology that wasn't terrestrial in origin. Not the Tesseract itself, but adjacent materials made fragments, residue, theoretical frameworks derived from studying the Tesseract that informed Howard's understanding of how energy generation at that scale was possible. Tony didn't know this. He genuinely reinvented the wheel, or thought he did. But the reason his wheel was so much better than anything else in the world is partly that his starting point, the inherited intuitions and materials his father left behind, was contaminated in the best possible way by contact with something that wasn't from this planet. It makes Tony's genius a collaboration across time with a father he never fully understood, which is the sort of symmetry the MCU tends to build in quietly and then never quite announce. This one is short, but I'm fond of it. When Nick Fury meets Tony in the donut shop, Tony is sitting inside a giant novelty donut on top of the shop, because of course he is. The framing of the scene is that Fury has come to brief him on the Avengers initiative and bring him in from the cold. But Fury didn't have to come to him. Fury could have waited. He could have sent an intermediary. The choice to come personally in an informal setting, at a moment of Tony's genuine vulnerability, reads less like recruitment and more like an observation exercise. Fury needed to know whether Tony was capable of accepting help, not whether he deserved it, not whether he was qualified, whether, at the actual worst moment of his life, he was willing to lower the defences enough to let someone assist him. Tony passes the test, sort of. He doesn't fully open up. He deflects and performs, but he sits down and he listens and he takes what Fury offers. And that was apparently sufficient. Fury's expression throughout the scene is less, "I am delivering important information," and more, "I am watching how you receive important information." The distinction is small, but it's there. Hydra is one of those things in the MCU that gets introduced as a fairly standard comic book villain organization. And then, by the time Captain America, the Winter Soldier, comes out, turns out to have been quietly rotting the entire structure of the MCU's world from the inside. The Winter Soldier is still, in my view, one of the best films in the franchise, specifically because of what it does with Hydra, not as a spectacle, but as an architecture. The idea that the heroes had been operating inside a compromised institution the whole time, that the victories were permitted, that the intelligence was corrupted, it's a quiet kind of horror, and it's the kind of thing that once you see it, you can't stop finding evidence of it everywhere you look. So here are the Hydra theories. Some of these are well established, a few are more obscure. One of them is genuinely a bit unsettling, which is my favourite kind. This one requires a bit of setup, but it's worth it. In the MCU's history, Hydra rose to power in Germany and effectively displaced the Nazi regime, or ran parallel to it, or superseded it, in ways that the films only glance at. The details are deliberately kept vague. In the Fox X-Men universe, Eric Lanshair, who becomes Magneto, discovers his powers as a direct consequence of his experiences in Nazi concentration camps. The trauma is the trigger. The specific circumstances of his persecution and survival are what activates his mutation. The theory, originally circulated on Reddit and never fully disproved, is that in the MCU's version of Who, Hydra's rise means the specific historical circumstances that would have created Magneto never happened in quite the same way, which means Eric Lanshair, if he exists in the MCU at all, never discovered his powers, never met Charles Xavier, never formed the X-Men. Mutants exist in the MCU's world, the genetics are there, but they've been dormant, suppressed or isolated because the historical catalyst that would have brought them together and out into the open was disrupted by the divergence in WW2. It's a genuinely elegant theory because it explains a real structural puzzle, why mutants have been absent from a fictional universe that technically should contain them, by using the MCU's own internal history rather than just saying they hadn't been introduced yet. It makes the absence of mutants a consequence of Hydra's history, which is also a rather dark implication. Hydra suppressed one atrocity and accidentally delayed the emergence of a class of people who might have been able to fight back against them. The reveal in The Winter Soldier is that Hydra had been embedded in S.H.I.E.L.D. since nearly the beginning. What the film doesn't linger on, because it would make the entire first phase of the MCU feel retroactively hollow, is how deep that means the compromise runs. The Avengers initiative itself was a S.H.I.E.L.D. program. The recruitment of Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, Bruce Banner, Natasha Romanoff. The response to the Chitauri invasion. All of it ran through an institution that Hydra had significant presence in, which means Hydra was watching all of it, evaluating all of it, and, where useful, nudging it. The theory is that the Avengers' early victories were, in some sense, permitted. Not because Hydra wanted them to succeed, but because Hydra recognized that an open alien invasion, successfully repelled by a group of enhanced humans, was more useful than an alien invasion that destroyed the world. A world-ending event gives Hydra nothing to control. A world that survived and is now terrified of extraterrestrial threats is a world primed for the security state infrastructure Project Insight was designed to provide. They let the Avengers win because the Avengers winning was part of the plan. That's the version of Phase 1 that the Winter Soldier implies without quite saying. Pierce is presented in the Winter Soldier as a brilliant, powerful man who was eventually turned or recruited by Hydra at some point in his adult career. That's the surface reading. The reading that holds up better is that the timeline doesn't quite work for a conversion narrative, that Pierce's integration into the organisation was too complete, too foundational to have happened in adulthood. Hydra, as we understand it by the end of the MCU's Phase 2, was operating on a generational recruitment timeline. They were thinking in decades. The kind of asset that Pierce represents, a man who rose through governmental and international security structures over 30 plus years while maintaining flawless Hydra loyalty, is not typically a convert. Converts have seams. They have moments of doubt, especially across that kind of time. Pierce doesn't show seams, he shows absolute integration. The theory is that Pierce was identified young, perhaps through a family connection, perhaps through early academic or military assessment, and recruited before his career began, not during it. His entire ascent through S.H.I.E.L.D. and international politics was Hydra's long game playing out exactly as designed, which means every position he held, every decision he made, was operating in service of an agenda he'd held for his entire adult life. That version of Pierce is significantly more chilling than the version the film presents. We know Bucky Barnes killed Howard and Maria Stark. That confirmation is one of the most devastating moments in Civil War, and it's handled beautifully. The weight of it, Tony's reaction, Steve's choice. But the Winter Soldier was an active Hydra asset for decades. Howard and Maria Stark were a 1991 operation. Bucky's activation presumably began much earlier than that. There are brief shots in the Winter Soldier of mission briefings, redacted files, targets. The visual language of the film suggests a catalogue of operations that spans years. What the evidence suggests is that the full Winter Soldier kill list, if it were ever revealed, would include names that the MCU has seeded elsewhere. Scientists whose deaths created research vacuums that benefited Hydra. Political figures whose absence changed the shape of international policy. People who would have been obstacles to the Hydra infrastructure being quietly constructed inside S.H.I.E.L.D. The reason I find this compelling is less about the specific names and more about what it says about Bucky as a character. Steve and the audience understand the Stark mission as the moral weight of what was done to Bucky, but the theory implies that weight is actually much larger, that there are families, research lines, political movements whose entire trajectories changed because of operations we've never seen. Bucky's reckoning with his past in this reading is a reckoning with a history that goes far deeper than what the films depict. This one sounds strange at first, but it holds together reasonably well. Red Skull's contact with the Tesseract, the Space Stone, in the first Avenger results in what appears to be spontaneous teleportation to Vormir, where he becomes the eternal guardian of the Soul Stone. The film presents this as a consequence, almost a punishment, delivered by the Space Stone itself in response to a being trying to wield power it wasn't entitled to. But Odin knew where the Soul Stone was. The MCU establishes, through Avengers, Endgame, and the Red Skull's own exposition on Vormir, that this isn't a coincidence. The Soul Stone has a guardian, has a specific process around it. It's not random. And Odin, who had spent centuries collecting and studying Infinity Stones, including, presumably, building the fake gauntlet revealed in Ragnarok as a deterrent, would have understood the relationship between the Space Stone and the Soul Stone's location well enough to engineer this outcome. The theory goes that Odin had prepared the Space Stone's response to a sufficiently dangerous wielder long before Schmidt got his hands on it. The exile to Vormir wasn't the stone acting on its own. It was Odin's contingency, a cosmic prison disguised as a cosmic accident. Red Skull's tortured existence guarding the Soul Stone for decades, unable to possess it, unable to leave, becomes, in this reading, a sentence handed down by Odin and executed by physics. Ulysses Klauer's repeated successful access to Wakanda's vibranium is one of those MCU details that the films sort of wave at without fully explaining. Wakanda is described as functionally impenetrable. Its technology is generations ahead of anything else in the world. Its intelligence and border security are, as Black Panther makes very clear, extraordinarily sophisticated. And yet Klauer got in, more than once, with significant resources and operational support. The case the theory makes is that someone inside Wakanda's political structure was facilitating it. Not a spy in the sense of someone turned by Western intelligence, but a member of one of the merchant or mining-adjacent councils who had their own reasons to want Wakanda's vibranium supply chain accessible to outside buyers. Hydra's global reach extended into every major institution, and Wakanda, for all its technological sophistication, was not immune to individual actors with individual motivations. This theory also adds something to the broader Hydra mythology. It suggests that their infiltration program wasn't limited to Western governmental structures, and that their reach was genuinely global in ways the MCU has only gestured at. The experiments Hydra ran on human subjects using Tesseract-derived technology are shown briefly and referred to obliquely across several MCU entries. The official history focuses on the failures, the people the technology killed, the subjects who didn't survive. But the theory is that the survival rate wasn't zero, that some subjects did survive the process, altered in ways that Hydra classified immediately and never released. The implication is that there are enhanced humans whose existence traces back to Wabibwatu, whose abilities derive not from gamma radiation or a super soldier serum, but from direct space stone energy exposure. These people, if they exist, are elderly by the MCU's present timeline, or their descendants carry dormant alterations in their genetics. The theory suggests this is one of the pipelines by which genuine, low-level enhanced humans appear throughout the MCU's wider world, not as superheroes, but as people with unexplained resilience or perception or capability, scattered through the population, untested and unaware. It also means Hydra has been aware of the enhanced human phenomenon since before the super soldier program existed. They didn't discover enhancement through the serum. The serum was their attempt to replicate and control something they'd already seen happen. Sitwell's death in The Winter Soldier is, on the surface, just another casualty of the action sequence. The Winter Soldier appears, throws Sitwell in front of a truck, fight ensues, plot continues. Quick, efficient, brutal, but Sitwell had just been extracting information from him. Nick Fury and Steve Rogers had gone to considerable lengths to capture and interrogate him, and he'd given up the algorithm's targeting criteria, which included Tony Stark, Bruce Banner, and Stephen Strange, in the moments before his death. He was in the middle of telling them something important. The theory is that Sitwell's death wasn't incidental. Hydra sacrificed him. The Winter Soldier wasn't just there to stop the heroes. He was there to ensure Sitwell couldn't finish talking. Because the full targeting list, the complete scope of Project Insight's criteria, was significantly more revealing than what Sitwell managed to say. He died mid-disclosure, and whatever he was about to add has never been addressed. This is one of those theories that lives in the space of what a film chose not to show, which is always slightly more interesting than what it did. Zola's digital existence in The Winter Soldier, the consciousness uploaded into banks of 1970s computer hardware, is destroyed when S.H.I.E.L.D. bombs the bunker at the end of the relevant scene. Clean death, or so it appears. But Zola, as a character, is defined by contingency planning. His whole contribution to Hydra's century-long project was the algorithm, a predictive system for identifying and neutralizing threats to Hydra's interests. The idea that a man defined by preparation wouldn't have prepared for the destruction of his primary hardware is, to put it gently, inconsistent with his character. In this reading, the algorithm, Not Zola's consciousness, but the core predictive system he built, was exported to external locations before the bunker's destruction. Running somewhere, still categorizing, still building lists. The digital Zola in the bunker was a backup of a backup, and the real operational version of his work continued on. This is partly supported by the fact that the algorithm Sitwell describes in The Winter Soldier sounds very much like a sophisticated machine learning system that once running would be extremely difficult to fully shut down just by destroying one physical location. Somewhere in the MCU's present timeline, a predictive system built by Arnim Zola is still running and still identifying threats. It just doesn't have anyone directing its output anymore, which might actually make it more dangerous. Everything else Hydra built, the Project Insight surveillance state, the asset program, the global political infiltration, was infrastructure. The theory is that the political ambitions of figures like Pierce were real but secondary. The primary goal, the one that the original Hydra under Schmidt pursued, and that the embedded Hydra inside S.H.I.E.L.D. was always working toward, was control of the Space Stone. The Tesseract grants access to the entire cosmos. It's the key to everywhere. Schmidt understood this, Zola understood this, and the Hydra embedded in S.H.I.E.L.D., which spent decades maintaining proximity to the Tesseract and its research program, was keeping the faith of an organization whose actual ambition was cosmic in scope, not political. World domination, in this reading, was never the goal. It was the precondition. You control Earth to control the Space Stone. You control the Space Stone to go everywhere else. The films never quite pull back far enough to state this explicitly, but it's the only reading of Hydra's 70-year patience that makes their actual behavior coherent. A political organization waiting 70 years to seize power is somewhat implausible. A religious organization waiting 70 years to recover a sacred object is entirely consistent with how human institutions actually behave. And that's the version of Hydra that makes them genuinely interesting rather than just menacing. There is an enormous amount of MCU lore buried in what Odin didn't tell people. His parenting strategy was essentially relevant information on a need-to-know basis, and you probably don't need to know. The 3 Thor films are, in large part, the story of his children discovering things he hid from them and dealing with the fallout. So a lot of the best Asgard theories are theories about Odin's intentions, what he knew, what he planned, and what he was quietly engineering across centuries that his children only discovered after he was gone. There's something genuinely melancholy about this section of MCU lore, which is partly why I find it so interesting to sit with. The standard reading of the Mjolnir enchantment is that it's a teaching tool. Odin takes his arrogant, warlike son, removes his power and banishes him, and attaches a condition. The hammer returns only when the bearer is worthy. Thor's arc in the first film is learning to be worthy. Lesson delivered. Hammer returned. Simple, except Hela, Odin's firstborn, was the original wielder of Mjolnir. This is confirmed explicitly in Ragnarok. She catches it, she holds it, and then she crushes it because its power is nothing compared to hers. Odin stripped Mjolnir from her when he imprisoned her, and the worthiness enchantment was added sometime after that. The theory is that the enchantment wasn't designed around Thor at all. It was designed around Hela. Odin needed a weapon he could use to fight Thor if Thor became what Hela became. The enchantment as contingency plan. But primarily, he needed to ensure that Hela, if she ever escaped her imprisonment, could not simply walk up and reclaim her old weapon. The whosoever is worthy language is a filter designed with a specific person in mind who would fail it. Hela's nature, conquest-driven, violent, incapable of the compassion the worthiness enchantment presumably measures, means she could never pass the test. Thor was the incidental beneficiary. The hammer was a lock, and Hela's name was on it. This one builds directly from the previous theory, and I think they work best together. If Odin had a contingency against Hela, the worthiness enchantment, it follows that he would have thought about contingencies for his other children as well. Thor, before his banishment, was arrogant, warmongering, and beginning to show the same patterns that had led Hela down her path. Odin knew about Nidavellir. He had a long relationship with the Dwarven Forges. What the evidence suggests is that Stormbreaker was commissioned by Odin with instructions left with Eitri, a weapon powerful enough to override a bearer's physical invulnerability, capable of delivering a blow that not even an Asgardian healing factor could completely dismiss. Something that could stop Thor if he had to be stopped without killing him. Eitri's reluctance in Infinity War to complete the weapon makes a certain kind of sense if the Forge had historical associations with the weapon he's being asked to complete. If the last time someone asked him to make this, the purpose was uncomfortably close to what Thor himself represents, he makes it anyway, because Thanos is the more pressing problem. But there's a history there that the film doesn't quite articulate. Stormbreaker, as the most powerful weapon in the MCU, becomes a slightly different object if you understand it as something that was designed, in part, to be pointed at its current wielder. The Bifrost is presented throughout the Thor films as a transportation technology. The Rainbow Bridge. Beautiful, ancient, occasionally dramatic when it malfunctions or gets destroyed. Thor uses it to travel between realms. The Asgardians use it to maintain their empire across the 9 realms. But there's a brief moment in the first Thor film where the Bifrost's energy, when focused continuously on a single point on Jotunheim, begins to destroy the planet. Thor has to break the bridge himself to stop it. That's not a transportation accident, that's a weapon being fired. The interesting version of this is that the Bifrost's use as a weapon isn't a one-off incident or an emergency measure. It's a known application that Asgard has used before. The reach of the Asgardian Empire across the 9 realms wasn't maintained purely through diplomacy or even conventional military force. Civilizations that resisted were, in at least some cases, neutralized by the Bifrost's focused energy application. Odin's empire was built on the same moral ambiguity as every historical empire, and the Bifrost was one of his most effective tools for enforcing it. Ragnarok gestures at this. Odin's hall is painted with images of conquest, and Hela is appalled by the attempt to paint over it. But the Bifrost's specific role in that history is never examined. Odin banished Hela, imprisoned her, and then, sometime later, at the end of a war with Jotunheim, found an abandoned frost giant infant and took him home. The theory is that this sequence was not coincidental. Odin had just spent decades or centuries watching what an heir built for conquest looked like. He had a firstborn who embodied everything the warrior culture of Asgard had produced at its most extreme. When he found Loki, he wasn't just acting charitably toward an abandoned child. He was engineering a different kind of heir, a diplomat, someone raised to understand complexity, to use words instead of weapons where possible, to think laterally. Frigga's magic lessons, Loki's upbringing in the library rather than the training ground. These weren't Loki being the lesser child. They were Odin's deliberate attempt to build the successor that Hela demonstrated he'd failed to produce the first time. Thor was the warrior prince he defaulted to because that's what Asgardian culture produced. But the son he was actually building, thoughtfully and with intention, was Loki. The tragedy of Thor and Loki is partly that Odin never told either of them this. These two characters are confirmed to be brothers in the MCU. They're both ancient, both obsessed with acquisition, both operating enormous collection operations in different corners of the universe. The standard reading is that they're competitors, or at least independent operators who happen to share ancestry. The argument runs like this: they're a system. The collector takes one category of objects, the grandmaster takes another. Their apparent rivalries are theatre. Their actual relationship is a centuries-old agreement that has allowed both of them to accumulate effectively, without interference from each other or from the more formal cosmic powers, like the Nova Corps. It would explain why neither of them is ever shown actively interfering with the other's operation. why their respective empires don't overlap, despite both having effectively unlimited resources and time. Competition between beings that old would presumably have resolved itself one way or the other by now. The more interesting explanation is that it resolved itself into cooperation. This is one of the older and more widely discussed MCU theories, but it belongs in any list like this because the evidence for it is genuinely robust. The Mind Stone in Loki's scepter has a radiant effect. Its active use, the mind control applied to Hawkeye and Selvig, is explicit, but the theory is that the stone's passive radiation was affecting everyone in proximity to it throughout the film. Specifically, Tony Stark touching the scepter early in the film, the team's increasingly intense interpersonal conflicts on the helicarrier, the paranoia and aggression that builds through the second act. The Avengers don't typically behave like that when they're not near the Mind Stone. Later films establish these are generally reasonable people capable of working together under pressure. On the helicarrier, they nearly tear each other apart over what should be manageable professional disagreements. Tony's behaviour is the most discussed. Touching the scepter seems to amplify whatever the stone is projecting, but the team-wide effect is the more interesting part of the theory. The Avengers' first major conflict was externally generated by a cosmic artifact, which means the team that formed at the end of the Avengers formed despite a significant, invisible obstacle. That's actually a more hopeful reading of the film than the straightforward one. During the party scene in Age of Ultron, where all the Avengers try to lift Mjolnir and fail, to general amusement, Thor grabs the hammer while Steve Rogers is also pulling on it. When Steve applies force, Mjolnir moves fractionally. Not much, not enough for anyone to notice. Thor's expression shifts briefly. What I think actually happened is this wasn't a joke beat that went slightly too far. Mjolnir genuinely moved for Steve, in a way it hadn't for any of the others. Thor saw it and consciously stopped himself from reacting, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging what it implied about Steve's worthiness, about it, and about the enchantment's relationship with who Thor is as a king. Endgame confirms that Steve can lift Mjolnir. So the question is when Steve first became worthy, and the Age of Ultron party is the most likely candidate. Thor knew, and he chose in that moment to let Steve think he'd failed. Whether that was generosity, not wanting to undermine Steve's confidence in his own worth, or something more complicated, is left to interpretation. This one is less a theory, and more a close reading that I find persuasive. Frigga is established throughout the Thor films as a sorceress of considerable power and wisdom. She would have been able to perceive Loki's true nature, the frost giant biology beneath the glamour Odin placed on him, with relative ease. The magic hiding Loki's appearance is Odin's work, but it's not described as undetectable to other practitioners. The theory is that Frigga knew and chose not to tell Loki for reasons of protection. Specifically, her magic lessons were designed around managing what she could see happening to him without his knowledge, the occasional instability that frost giant energy creates, the emotional volatility that comes from a nature at war with a presented identity, the moments where his power exceeded what his Asgardian presenting self could account for. She was quietly maintaining him across his entire childhood, catching things he couldn't see. That's the version of Frigga the theory points toward, and it makes her death in the dark world significantly more sad. Loki loses the one person who knew exactly what he was and chose to love him anyway. Hela kills Volstagg and Fandral almost immediately upon her return in Ragnarok, and kills Hogun shortly after. The film treats these deaths as efficient. They're demonstrations of Hela's power for the audience, quick and brutal. The theory is that they weren't random. Hela studied Thor before confronting him. She knew his friendships, his emotional architecture, the people who ground him and give him reasons beyond his own survival to fight. Removing them before engaging Thor directly was tactical. A Thor who arrives at Asgard to find his friends alive is a Thor with anchors, with people to protect, with reasons to negotiate. with emotional leverage available to his opponent. A Thor who arrives to find them dead has only grief and rage available, which are less strategically useful to him than calm and protection. It's a small theory, but it reframes Hela as a significantly more strategic villain than she reads in the film, where she mostly seems to enjoy the killing for its own sake. The two aren't mutually exclusive. She enjoyed it, and it was calculated. This is one I don't see discussed as often, and I find genuinely interesting. The MCU Asgardians don't age the way humans do. Their lifespan is described as effectively unlimited, barring violence or illness. The explanation given in the films is that they're more biologically robust, but the theory is that it's not purely biological. Asgardian vitality is tied, in this reading, to their connection to the magical energy that flows through the 9 realms. The same energy that Mjolnir channels, that Odin wields, that underlies the Bifrost. It's a form of ambient life force that Asgardians are attuned to, and that sustains them beyond what pure biology would allow. The implication for the snap is that the Soul Stone, which is at its core a soul processing mechanism, would interact differently with Asgardian life force than with human biology. The 50% of Asgardians who were taken by the snap may have experienced something different from the instantaneous dissolution that humans experienced. The soul energy entanglement makes their specific fate under the snap mechanics genuinely ambiguous. It also adds a layer to Thor's grief in Endgame that the film handles mostly through depression and weight gain and bad jokes, which is perfectly valid but doesn't quite get at the cosmic dimension of what he lost. I could do an entire separate video about Loki, maybe 2. He's the MCU character who's accumulated the most genuinely interesting theoretical material around him, partly because he's been in the most films, partly because his character is specifically built around deception and hidden agendas, and partly because the Loki series opened up a whole new layer of lore that's still being processed. These theories span from the films through to the series. A few of them interact with each other in ways that I'll flag as we go. Every Loki death before Infinity War had an escape hatch. He died in the Dark World, and it was a ruse. He died at various other moments throughout the franchise and reappeared. The character was so associated with survival through deception that his death in Infinity War's opening minutes was almost universally read as another fake. The theory, or rather, the reading I'm convinced is correct, is that this one was different. Not because Thanos is stronger, though he is, but because Loki, for the first time, had nothing left to gain from surviving. His people were mostly dead. The ruse, if he had one, would have served no purpose, and crucially, he had already handed over the Tesseract. There was nothing left to bargain with. What happens instead is that he makes one genuine attempt at Thanos' life, knowing it won't work, and then tells him that the Tesseract, or rather the Space Stone, he says we have a Hulk, which reads as an attempt at misdirection, and then it just doesn't work. Look, the scene is complex, but the point is he dies without a plan. He dies reaching for something real. It's the most honest moment in his entire arc across the franchise, and the films treat it as such. His last words are, "You will never be a god," to Thanos, who then kills him. It's not a survival play, it's a declaration. In the Endgame time heist, the 2012 version of Loki, who was captured after the Battle of New York, before his arc across the Dark World, and Ragnarok, escapes with the Tesseract when the 2023 Avengers operation goes sideways. He vanishes into a new timeline. The theory is that this isn't a separate variant in any meaningful sense. This is the direct origin of the character we follow in the Loki series. The moment he picks up that Tesseract and disappears, he enters a sequence of events that leads eventually to his capture by the TVA. The Loki series is the story of what happened to that specific Loki after Endgame created him. This matters because it means the entire Loki series is a direct consequence of the Avengers time heist, and the time heist was itself made necessary by the original Thanos snap. The timeline in which Loki becomes the person he becomes in the series is a branching consequence of everything the Avengers did in their attempt to fix the snap, which is a kind of cosmic irony that He Who Remains probably enjoyed. He Who Remains presents himself as the ultimate planner, a being who has pruned infinite timelines and managed the sacred timeline for centuries. His entire situation at the Citadel involves him having watched everything happen and having arranged it. The arrival of Loki and Sylvie isn't a deviation from his plan. It's the conclusion of it. What he needed was someone to kill him. He was tired. He'd been doing this for too long. But he couldn't just let a random variant through. It had to be someone whose arrival would trigger specific consequences. Sylvie's enchantment power, Loki's particular psychological journey, the specific emotional dynamic between them. These were what He Who Remains needed at the end of his tenure, not to stop them, but to be stopped by them. Everything the TVA did to Loki, putting him through the process of confronting his own variants, his own potential futures, his own capacity for something other than self-interest, was preparation. He Who Remains needed Loki to be a specific kind of person when he arrived at the Citadel, a person capable of the choice the series ending asks of him. In Season 2, Loki makes a sacrifice that restructures the entire timeline architecture. He Who Remains left a gap in the system that was shaped exactly like that sacrifice. He knew what was coming. The TVA is the most powerful temporal organization in existence, and it runs on paper files, physical stamps, cassette tapes, and mid-century bureaucratic aesthetics. Every fan theory I've seen treats this as aesthetic choice, a joke about the absurdity of infinite power expressed in mundane administration. And it's not a joke, it's a security decision. Digital systems can be hacked, copied, corrupted. Magical systems can be enchanted, overridden, redirected. A physical paper file in a locked room in a building outside of time is extraordinarily difficult to tamper with without physical presence. The TVA's aesthetic isn't retro because He Who Remains had a design preference. It's retro because the analog nature of the system is its primary security feature. In a universe where variants can manipulate time, magic, and technology, the most secure possible administrative system is one that runs on materials that require a physical body in a physical location to interact with. The entire TVA infrastructure is, in its peculiar way, the most sophisticated security architecture in the MCU. Mobius never gets to ride a jet ski. He talks about it. He thinks about it. It's clearly a source of genuine longing for him throughout the series. And it's also completely inaccessible to him while he's working for the TVA. The theory is that this isn't accidental. He Who Remains planted these kinds of desires, things that can never be fulfilled within the TVA's structure, in pruned agents specifically to create a psychological condition of mild, persistent dissatisfaction combined with loyalty to the institution. An agent who is fully content has no particular reason to maintain their current situation. An agent who has something to look forward to, something they're working toward, even without knowing it, has a forward momentum that keeps them functional and invested. Mobius's jet ski is a hook. He Who Remains knew that the TVA would function best if its agents were kept in a state of gentle, perpetual, almost contentment, close enough to happy to stay, far enough from fulfilled to keep working. It's a fairly dark reading of what seems like a charming character detail. The variants we meet in the Loki series all share a structural tendency. They come close to achieving something significant and then undermine themselves at a critical moment. Classic Loki nearly escaped Thanos and chose to reveal himself. Other variants implode at moments of apparent victory. The pattern repeats. He Who Remains engineered this, that's the theory. He needed Loki variants as temporal operatives, useful, capable, deniable, but he needed them unable to actually succeed at anything that threatened his own position. So he built the self-sabotage in. At the deepest level of their psychology, every Loki variant is wired to flinch away from genuine power, which makes the Loki of Season 2 remarkable because the thing he ultimately does, the sacrifice at the end of the series, is the one action the engineering couldn't prevent, because it was an act of giving up power rather than claiming it. He Who Remains built a mechanism against conquest. He didn't build one against love. The TVA's stated purpose is to maintain the sacred timeline and prevent branching realities from triggering a multiversal war. This is presented as a tragic necessity. He Who Remains doing something genuinely terrible for what he believes are genuinely good reasons. The good reasons are largely constructed. That's the uncomfortable reading. The sacred timeline wasn't the only path that didn't lead to a multiversal war. It was the only path that led specifically to He Who Remains' survival and continued dominance. The Nexus events that the TVA pruned weren't cosmically dangerous to the universe. They were personally inconvenient to a very old, very powerful man who'd arranged the timeline to make sure certain things always happened in certain ways. The multiversal war he feared wasn't a natural consequence of branching timelines. It was a specific set of circumstances involving his own variants. He arranged the entire TVA to prevent a problem he himself created, and then presented the whole operation as selfless cosmic management. That's the kind of reveal that, once you see it, makes the character significantly more interesting than a well-intentioned dictator. The series shows us that TVA agents were pruned from their timelines and given implanted memories. B-15 recovers her original memories partway through Season 1 and is clearly shaken by them. The show gives us her emotional reaction without giving us the content of what she remembered. The theory is that this isn't just a character beat without follow-through. It's deliberate withholding of information that will be relevant later. The specifics of who B-15 was before the TVA are known to the writers and will eventually matter. The most popular variant of this theory is that her original identity had a relationship, romantic or familial, with someone from the main MCU timeline, making her a personal connection that grounds the TVA in the wider MCU. The fact that the series chose to show her emotional reaction and then not show us what caused it is a creative choice. And creative choices like that in MCU properties tend to have a purpose. Sylvie's enchantment ability, the capacity to enter another person's mind and project illusions from their memories, is distinctive enough that its origin is worth examining. We don't get a clear explanation of where it came from or how she developed it. The theory is that it's a self-taught form of something that, in the sacred timeline, Frigga teaches Loki. Sylvie's native timeline was close enough to the sacred timeline that she would have had frost giant heritage expressing similarly. Her early life, before the TVA pruned her as an infant, would have set her on a trajectory that included the kind of latent magical capacity that Asgardian lineage produces. Without a teacher, she improvised. The result is a less refined but equally powerful version of the mental and illusory magic that Loki, in the main timeline, learned from their mother. It's a connection between Sylvie and Loki that neither of them quite articulates. They are, in a sense, both trying to be what they would have been if Frigga had been able to teach them. The Void is presented as a purgatory at the end of time, where everything the TVA prunes is sent to be consumed by Alioth, an enormous temporal entity that dissolves whatever it encounters. Clean and final, what gets pruned is gone. The theory is that consumed is not the same as destroyed. Alioth is a temporal being that processes and absorbs. The things it takes in don't cease to exist. They're incorporated, stored in a different form inside the entity or in the substrate of the Void itself, which would mean the Void is effectively He Who Remains' private archive of everything he's ever pruned. Every timeline, every variant, every Nexus event, it's all still there in some compressed form inside the Void's ecology. The classic Loki variant surviving there for extended periods supports this. They're not simply surviving despite the environment. They're surviving because the environment is designed to contain rather than destroy. He who remains could, in theory, retrieve things from the void. Things he decided to take off the timeline temporarily, but wanted to study. The implications of that are fairly significant. WandaVision is the MCU project that most completely changed how I watch everything else. And I say that as someone who genuinely loved most of what came before it. There's something about the way WandaVision handles grief, through the specific lens of someone with reality-altering power processing a loss that reality can't reverse, that felt genuinely new. And the theories around Wanda are theories about grief as much as they're theories about superpowers, which is why this section goes to some fairly interesting places. This is the theory with the most far-reaching implications in the whole list. The setup is this. The Hydra experiments during Age of Ultron's backstory exposed multiple subjects to the Mind Stone. Only Wanda and Pietro survived. Every other subject died. If the Mind Stone was purely conferring powers, the survival rate would likely be higher, or at least less specifically, 2. The theory is that Wanda and Pietro survived because their biology was already capable of interfacing with the Mind Stone's energy. They had something the other subjects didn't. And that something is what the MCU, in its later phases, will eventually call an X gene. Wanda is the MCU's first real mutant, not created by cosmic energy exposure, revealed by it. The Mind Stone didn't make her, it found her. The difference matters because it means her power isn't borrowed or external, it's intrinsic. It's what she is at a cellular level, in ways that no amount of Darkhold contamination, or grief, or loss can take away. This also retroactively explains why she's so significantly more powerful than virtually everyone else who encounters the Mind Stone's energy. She wasn't amplified by it. She was recognized by it. Pietro recounts the bomb story in Age of Ultron, the shell that didn't detonate. He and Wanda waited beside it for 2 days, certain it would kill them. It didn't. The official explanation is luck. A dud. The theory is that it wasn't luck and it wasn't a dud. Their father, who in the comics is Eric Lynn Scher, though the MCU has been cagey about this, used latent metal manipulation abilities in his dying moments to prevent the detonation. It cost him his life. He died saving his children with powers he may not have even consciously understood he possessed. This theory has 2 interesting implications. First, it confirms that whatever genetic heritage Wanda and Pietro carry was present in their father, who died before it could be discovered or developed. Second, it means the twins have always been protected by something they couldn't see. Their survival has never been purely circumstantial. The grief reading of WandaVision is correct. Wanda built the Hex because she couldn't process Vision's death, and she rebuilt him inside it because she couldn't accept his absence. That's the emotional truth of the show, and it's beautifully handled. There's a layer beneath that, though. Vision's body still existed, stored at S.H.I.E.L.D's facility. The Mind Stone was gone from it. But Mind Stone energy isn't something that disappears cleanly. It's established throughout the MCU that the stones leave traces, that their influence persists in the things they've touched. What this comes down to is that Wanda, at a level below her conscious grief, was reaching for the residual Mind Stone energy in Vision's body because she could feel it was still there. The Hex wasn't just a recreation. It was an attempt to reconstitute something that was genuinely still present, scattered and diffuse in the materials of what S.H.I.E.L.D had stored. The Vision she rebuilt wasn't pure invention. He was, partly, a reconstruction built around a real remnant that she could sense but not precisely locate, which gives a different weight to Vision's question in the finale. What is grief, if not love persevering? If you understand that the love in question had a physical, energetic component as well as an emotional one. Agatha is revealed through the series to be an extremely powerful witch who survived her own Kuvon's execution attempt, who has been practicing magic for centuries, and who recognized the Scarlet Witch's chaos magic from the moment she arrived in Westview. Her power level demonstrated throughout the season, is genuinely formidable. And then Wanda defeats her, fairly decisively, once she understands the runes. The theory is that the defeat was permitted. Agatha is a centuries-old practitioner whose primary skill is exactly this kind of manipulation, putting herself in situations where other people think they've won, while she continues toward her real objective. Getting trapped in the Agnes persona is the kind of ending that only works as a genuine defeat if you ignore everything the show has established about how Agatha operates. The theory is that she wanted to be close to the Scarlet Witch, to study chaos magic from the inside, to be present, dormant and watchful when the next significant event in Wanda's life occurred. Being imprisoned in Westview as Agnes is the long game, not the defeat. Agatha All Along, the subsequent series, doesn't entirely resolve this, but it does rather suggest that Agatha continued to have her own agenda throughout her apparent captivity. When Wanda collapses the hex at the end of WandaVision, she says goodbye to her sons, and they disappear along with everything else she created. The official framing is that they cease to exist. She created them from chaos magic, and they return to it. The theory is that this isn't quite right. The chaos magic that Wanda used to create them is real magic with real effects. The souls she generated for them, the consciousness, the personhood, are not something that can simply be uncreated. What happened when the hex collapsed is that the physical forms dispersed, but the souls that had developed within those forms didn't have anywhere to go. They entered the general substrate of the multiverse. This is the setup for their reappearance, presumably as the characters Billy and Tommy, in contexts that have nothing to do with Wanda's grief. The free-floating soul theory is the mechanism by which they can exist across multiple timelines without Wanda's direct involvement in creating them again. She made them once, the multiverse is maintaining them now. Hayward's agenda throughout WandaVision is to recover Vision's body and reactivate it as a weapon. The hex complicates this, but also accelerates it. Wanda's rebuilding of Vision gives Hayward the energy source he needed to complete the reactivation. The theory is that Hayward anticipated this, not necessarily the specific form of the hex, but the general shape of the outcome. He knew that Wanda would eventually exhaust herself, that the chaos magic would be accessible once she'd poured enough of it into Vision's body, and that the result would be a Vision he could control, one without memories, without emotional bonds, without any of the inconvenient humanity that S.H.I.E.L.D. had never wanted. Hayward's desperation throughout the series reads, in this theory, as performance. He's not failing to contain the situation. He's allowing it to develop toward the outcome he wanted. White Vision, a fully operational synthezoid with no attachment to Wanda, no loyalty to the Avengers, and no emotional anchors, was the goal from the moment he had Vision's body. This one is strange, and I want to be upfront about that. But strange doesn't mean wrong. The Darkhold contains a prophecy about the Scarlet Witch, a specific description of who she is, what she can do, and what her destiny involves. The theory is that this prophecy exists in the Darkhold, not because some ancient author predicted Wanda Maximoff, but because Wanda Maximoff, in a future or alternate timeline, wrote it. Chaos magic, as the MCU defines it, is specifically connected to probability and possibility rather than linear cause and effect. A sufficiently powerful chaos magic user, in a moment of extreme power or extreme duress, could potentially author text that existed before she was born. The Scarlet Witch prophecy is a self-fulfilling loop. The prophecy shapes Wanda into the Scarlet Witch, and the Scarlet Witch wrote the prophecy. It's the kind of temporal knot that the MCU tends to leave slightly unresolved, because the resolution would require more exposition than it's worth. But as a structural theory about how the Darkhold works, and why it knew so much about a specific person centuries before that person existed, it's cleaner than any alternative explanation. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness shows Wanda as thoroughly corrupted by the Darkhold, ruthless, monomaniacal, willing to destroy other versions of herself to reach her children. The film presents the Darkhold as having done this to her. The theory is more nuanced. The grief that drives Wanda in that film was real and pre-existing. The loss of vision, the loss of Tommy and Billy, the years of accumulated trauma, that was already there before she ever touched the Darkhold. What the Darkhold did was provide a direction and an amplification for something that was already building pressure. It didn't create the obsession. It gave the obsession a plan. This matters because it means the Darkhold corrupted her reading, lets the grief off the hook. The actual thing that drives Wanda's actions in Multiverse of Madness is the same thing that drove her to create the Hex, a love so total and a loss so complete that she couldn't find a shape for her life that didn't involve finding a way back to what she'd lost. The Darkhold just handed her the instruction manual. Strange looks at 14,605 possible futures before Infinity War's final act. He tells Tony only that there's one in which they win. He doesn't say anything about who survives it. The theory is that among those 14 million outcomes, there were several where Doctor Strange survived, where the victory came at a cost that didn't include his own life. And he specifically chose the outcome where Tony Stark was the one to make the sacrifice, because that was the only version of the future where the victory meant something large enough to justify the cost. Strange giving up the Time Stone to Thanos, the single action he said he would never take, is explained in the film as him having seen that this was the necessary path. But the theory adds that he also saw the path where he was the one who died and Tony lived, and calculated that the world needed Tony's sacrifice more than his own. Not because Strange's life matters less, but because Tony's death, the inciting first hero, the man who started all of this, would become the thing that unified and redefined what the Avengers were going forward. It reframes Strange's "we're in the endgame now" as something other than grim acceptance. It reads as something closer to a choice. Thanos believed the snap was random. That's his explicit position. Random selection, mathematically precise, half of all life. No bias, no preference, no judgment. The theory is that the Soul Stone, which is specifically a soul processing mechanism, doesn't operate randomly when it's used. It makes judgments. The Infinity Stones are not passive tools. They have intelligence, intention, will. The Reality Stone constructs. The Time Stone perceives. The Soul Stone evaluates. The half of all life that the snap removed was the half that the Soul Stone determined was, in some sense, expendable to the continuation of the larger cosmic order, which raises genuinely uncomfortable questions about what criteria it used. Were the people who survived selected because they had more to do? Were those who vanished protected in some way, held in the soul world, rather than simply killed? The snap spared some very specific people and took some others. The pattern, if there is one, has never been fully examined. Peter Parker's corner of the MCU is one of the more emotionally concentrated parts of the franchise. The 3 Holland Spider-Man films are, taken together, a complete arc about identity and loss that I think holds up as the most coherent individual character story in the whole MCU, which means the theories around Peter are often theories about the emotional architecture of those films, rather than just plot puzzles, and that's an interesting space to spend some time in. We talked earlier about the Iron Man 2 kid and the specific shape of Tony's surveillance on Peter, so I won't go back over that. What I want to sit with in this section is something that the end of No Way Home does that I don't think gets examined enough. At the end of that film, Peter asks Strange to make everyone forget he exists. Not just forget he's Spider-Man, forget Peter Parker entirely. MJ, Ned, happy. Every person he loves and who loves him back is still alive. He's not dying. He's not making a sacrifice that costs him his life. He's making a sacrifice that costs him his relationships. Permanently, while everyone he's lost remains walking around in the world, simply unable to find him. The theory is that this is structurally the hardest thing any character in the MCU has ever done. Tony died, but his family remembered him. Natasha died, but Clint carries her. Steve left, but Sam and Bucky knew why and where he went. Peter makes himself invisible to the people he loves who are still breathing, and he has to keep being Spider-Man, knowing that if May were alive, she wouldn't know him. That if he walked past MJ on the street, she'd look through him. What the theory does with this is point to it as the definitive divergence from every other Spider-Man across the multiverse. The other two Peter Parkers at the end of that film have their people. The MCU's Peter has nobody except the mask. That choice, freely made, not imposed, is the thing that makes him genuinely different from every variant that exists. His origin story isn't a bite or a death or a power. It's a decision made at 19 to give up everyone who knew him. The MCU version of Peter's danger sense is referred to as a Peter tingle in Far From Home, which is comedic but also slightly undersells what it might actually be. The comic's web of life and destiny is a cosmic framework that connects all spider people across the multiverse, a living web of narrative destiny that a spider totem sits at the center of. The theory is that Peter's danger sense isn't purely a biological function of his altered nervous system. It's a direct sensory connection to this cosmic architecture, which is why it behaves as more than just an early warning system. It guides him towards specific actions. It reacts to threats that haven't fully materialized yet. It functions more like intuition than reflex. It also explains why three Spider-Men from different universes instinctively recognize each other and function as a unit in No Way Home, without any learning curve. The web connects them. They know each other on some level below thought because they're all nodes on the same structure. The tingle isn't just a warning, it's a homing signal for spider totems. Quentin Beck is presented in Far From Home as a liar and a manipulator, and he is both of those things. But the theory asks you to look at the backstory his crew presents and consider that the legitimate grievance underneath the villainy is real. Beck contributed significantly to Stark Industries' holographic technology program. BARF was either his work or work he was central to, and Tony Stark got the credit, the patents, the public recognition. Beck was let go. His professional legacy was absorbed into Stark's, and his contribution was erased from the official history. He's not wrong about this. He was wronged. The pathological response, constructing an elaborate fake superhero persona to fill the void Stark left, requiring mass casualty threats to maintain the fiction, is obviously not a proportionate response to being fired. But the original wound is real. Beck wanted to be the person the world looked up to. He was told that person was already Tony Stark, and that he was replaceable. His villainy is a grief response dressed up as ambition. This doesn't make him sympathetic in any simple way, but it does make him more interesting than a simple liar. And it makes Peter's journey in Far From Home, inheriting Tony's legacy in a world that's hungry for the next Iron Man. A story about two people responding to Tony Stark's absence in completely opposite ways. Stranger's spell is the inciting incident of No Way Home, the thing that cracks the multiverse and brings the visitors through. But the theory is that the most consequential event in that film, in terms of what it does to the structure of the MCU's Peter Parker, is May's death. The two other Peter Parkers in that film have Aunt Mays who are alive. They've had different losses and different formative moments, but May is still there for both of them. The MCU's Peter loses her in the middle of the film, at the moment of maximum vulnerability, in a way that fundamentally alters his relationship to heroism and to his own identity. With great power comes great responsibility is a line both other Peter Parkers know and have built their understanding of Spider-Man around. For the MCU's Peter, it comes to him for the first time from May, in her dying moments. He receives it as grief rather than principle. It becomes his origin story, 4 films in. He was already Spider-Man. May's death is when he became Peter Parker in the fullest sense. Every variant of Peter from that point forward diverges from this one in ways that have nothing to do with the multiverse spell. He's been made different by a loss that didn't happen to them. This one is small but persistent. Throughout Homecoming and Far From Home, MJ demonstrates a pattern of noticing things she shouldn't be able to notice, at moments when noticing them is important. She picks up on Peter's Spider-Man connection before anyone else. She processes threats with unusual speed and without the paralysis most people show in dangerous situations. What the evidence points toward is a very low-level version of Peter's danger sense, expressed as intuition and pattern recognition rather than the full reflex system Peter operates on. It would make her the MCU's version of the comics Michelle Jones, who has always been a character with her own distinct capability set. It also explains why she and Peter function so naturally as a partnership. They're both operating on a slightly elevated threat awareness, which creates a rhythm of communication that most people don't have access to. Nothing explicit in the films confirms this, but nothing in the films contradicts it either. Strange's spell pulled in people from other universes who knew Peter Parker was Spider-Man. That's the stated mechanism. The underlying argument is that the spell's scope was shaped by something larger than just that criteria. The web of life and destiny specifically needed 3 spider totems in the same place at the same time, for reasons that the MCU hasn't fully articulated yet. The villains came through the spell. The 2 older Peter Parkers came through the spell. But their particular arrival, these specific versions of the character, at this moment in the MCU's continuity, reads as too specifically useful to be accidental. The web needed the 2 experienced Spider-Men to be there to support the MCU's Peter through the specific losses he was about to experience. It needed them there to confirm for him what he was supposed to become. The spell was the mechanism. The web was the intention behind it. The opening of No Way Home includes Peter, MJ and Ned all being rejected from MIT despite strong academic records, in a sequence of rejections that's treated as a consequence of the publicity around Mysterio's death and the Spider-Man identity reveal. The framing is that the university didn't want the controversy. The theory is that the rejections were actively coordinated rather than passively consequential. Someone with access to Mysterio's Edith footage, the evidence Beck fabricated linking Peter to the London attack, used institutional channels to ensure that Peter's academic future was foreclosed. Not as a secondary consequence of the media coverage, but as a targeted action. Who would do this is the part the theory doesn't fully nail down. But the precision of 3 simultaneous rejections from the same institution, coordinated enough to arrive effectively at the same time, doesn't quite read as organic institutional risk management. In the No Way Home post-credits scene, Eddie Brock and Venom are transported into the MCU briefly, confused, and then pulled back to their own universe when the multiverse starts to stabilize. Before they go, Venom leaves a small piece of the symbiote on the bar. The theory is that this wasn't accidental. Venom, who has hive mind connections to the symbiote collective across universes, recognized the MCU's universe as the one containing the spider totem most relevant to the symbiote's interests. The piece left behind is a seed. It's not a stray fragment from an entity that didn't mean to leave it. It's a deliberate establishment of presence in a universe that the symbiote collective has identified as significant. In the comics, the relationship between Venom and Spider-Man is one of the defining dynamics of Spider-Man's mythology. The MCU is setting that up slowly, through exactly this kind of quiet seeding. The MCU deliberately avoids showing or explaining Uncle Ben's death. This is often read as wanting to distinguish this version of Peter from the Raimi films, but the theory notes that Happy Hogan's specific discomfort around the subject, in the moments where it's adjacent to conversation, suggests he has knowledge rather than just general awareness. Happy worked for Tony Stark. Tony, as established, had been watching Peter before Civil War. If Tony had surveillance on Peter, that surveillance predates the Spider-Man activity. It potentially includes the period around Ben Parker's death. Happy, as Tony's point person for the Peter Parker operation, may have access to information about what happened that none of the other characters have. The silence around Ben in the MCU is too consistent to be accidental. Someone knows something, and the most likely candidate for knowing is the person who was closest to Tony's operation and who demonstrates the most discomfort when the subject arises. This one is more emotional than plot relevant, but I find it genuinely moving. Happy's relationship with Peter throughout the MCU is one of reluctant affection that slowly becomes genuine care. He loved Tony. Tony loved Peter. Happy processes his grief through the most practical channel available. The theory is that after Tony died, Happy quietly arranged for Stark estate resources, the kind that a former head of security for Stark Industries would have administrative access to flow toward Peter's life in ways that maintained his ability to function as Spider-Man without financial precarity. Not as a formal trust, nothing documented. Just the resources arriving when they were needed, in forms that could be explained other ways. It's the kind of thing the films would never show directly, because it doesn't require a scene. It's just something that would happen if the characters are who they seem to be. Some of the best MCU theories are about characters who are barely in the films. People who appear in 2 or 3 scenes, do something that sticks in the memory, and then are either ignored or killed off before anyone can ask the follow-up questions. This section is for those theories, the ones that live in the margins of the franchise. Captain Marvel establishes that Nick Fury's eye was scratched out by a Skrull cat, not in some dramatic combat moment. This is partly a joke at the expense of his gravitas, but it also establishes that Fury, at the point of Captain Marvel, had been working with Talos for some time and trusted him completely. The theory is that Fury, in the years between Captain Marvel and the beginning of Phase 1, made a deliberate decision to allow Skrull operatives to integrate into S.H.I.E.L.'s structure. Not as an invasion, as an intelligence asset. Skrulls can impersonate anyone, gather intelligence from positions of deep cover, and maintain operations in places a human agent can't reach. Fury is specifically the kind of person who would make this arrangement, consider it a reasonable operational trade-off, and tell absolutely nobody. His micro-expression when Talos impersonates Keller in Captain Marvel reads, on second viewing, less like shock and more like recognition. He knew something was possible here. He wasn't surprised, he was assessing. I want to say up front that I find this theory genuinely credible, and I think the reason it hasn't been more widely accepted is that Secret Invasion was such a frustrating watch that a lot of people stopped paying attention to its implications before the credits rolled. Here's the case for it. Secret Invasion is built around Skrull infiltration of powerful human figures. Maria Hill dies early in the series in a way that's narratively abrupt and that serves more as a shock device than as a meaningful character conclusion. She's been through a decade of MCU events. She survived the snap, survived the blip, survived the S.H.I.E.L.D. Hydra collapse, and she dies in the second episode of a Disney Plus show that most people are watching half-heartedly on a Thursday evening. The theory is that the Maria Hill who dies was a Skrull replacement. The real Maria Hill was taken and substituted at some point before the series events, possibly significantly before. Her death, while real, is the death of an operative rather than the original person. What I find genuinely compelling about this isn't the shock mechanics of actually she's alive. It's what the real Maria Hill's unaccounted for whereabouts implies about what she's been doing in the intervening years. Maria Hill, with full operational knowledge, running off-grid, having already survived one revelation that everything she trusted was compromised. That's a character worth finding. The MCU may have simply buried her there deliberately, in a series almost everyone wrote off, waiting for someone to come looking. Thunderbolts confirms that Ross has been slowly becoming the Red Hulk over a longer period than the Abomination incident would suggest. The theory fills in the timeline. His exposure to the Gamma program, which he was running and overseeing, not just adjacent to, involved repeated contact with irradiated materials and subjects over decades. The physiological changes are slow at this level of exposure, but they accumulate. The pills he takes in the MCU's later phases aren't standard cardiac medication or blood pressure management. They're suppressants, compounds designed to slow the gamma radiation's expression in his tissue and prevent a spontaneous transformation. He's been managing this for years. The Red Hulk transformation in Thunderbolts isn't an emergency. It's the suppression finally failing. The GH325 project that revived Coulson in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. involved extensive memory modification. The cover memory, Tahiti, it's a magical place, is the top layer. The theory is that beneath the cover memory are gaps where original Coulson memories were extracted rather than simply replaced. This was a practical decision by whoever supervised the procedure. Certain memories, specific operational knowledge, relationships that would create complications, self-knowledge that might interact poorly with the resurrection process, were removed. The Coulson that comes back from Tahiti is Coulson, but with gaps. The personality that emerges in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is shaped partly by those gaps, by the places where his identity should connect with something that isn't there anymore. The theory suggests that whatever was removed is stored somewhere in the GH325 program's archives. That some version of pre-death Coulson's most complete knowledge base exists in S.H.I.E.L.D.'s files, separated from the person it belongs to. This theory received partial semi-confirmation when the Watcher appeared in What If and was described as having informants across the multiverse. But the theory had been circulating for years before that, and the specifics of it are what make it interesting rather than just charming. The MCU cameos aren't just Stan Lee appearing as a friendly Easter egg. They're the same person, in wildly different locations, at wildly different points in time, always present at a moment of cosmic significance. He's at the Stark Expo, he's at the Battle of New York adjacent area, he's on Nowhere, briefly, in the Collector's vicinity. He's a postal worker, he's a DJ, he's reading a script on a 1995 bus. No ordinary person has this kind of temporal and geographical distribution. He's not a fan showing up places. He's an observer placed at specific events. The Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 cameo is the most direct confirmation the MCU has offered. He's shown talking to a group of Watchers, describing his many adventures as their informant. The Watchers listen with studied indifference and then ignore him, which is both very funny and very consistent with how the Watchers operate. They receive reports, they do not act on them. What makes this more than just a cute production choice is the implication it carries. Every significant event in the MCU's history was being monitored and reported to cosmic beings who observed and did nothing. The record exists. Somewhere, in whatever passes for the Watcher's archive, there is a complete account of the MCU from an observer who was there for all of it. The MCU consistently positions Strange as the Sorcerer Supreme and the primary magical asset of the planet. Wong is his colleague, his librarian, his Kamar-Taj administrator, the support character. The reading I find most convincing is that this hierarchy is maintained by Wong's deliberate choice rather than by actual ability. Wong is older in the mystic arts, has been practicing longer, and demonstrates throughout his appearances a calm and efficiency that suggests power held in reserve rather than power approaching its limits. His management of situations that Strange finds difficult is never particularly strained. When he's at his most effective, in the Infinity War Battle of New York, in Endgame, he seems entirely unhurried. Strange is still learning in some sense, still reaching for his ceiling. Wong already knows where his ceiling is and has chosen a role that doesn't require him to approach it. The librarian, the administrator, the man who knows where things are and what they do, that's a power base, not a fallback position. Kraglin struggles with the Yucca arrow throughout Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. The whistling control mechanism was Yondu's, developed over a lifetime of use, and Kraglin simply hasn't had the practice. His attempts to use it in Volume 2 result in him accidentally stabbing Drax. He's not good at it yet. By the time we see him in Thor, Love and Thunder and What If, he's significantly better. The standard explanation is practice. But the theory notes that his improvement correlates specifically with Yondu's funeral, that something about the emotional experience of that loss created a connection between Kraglin and the arrow that goes beyond technical skill development. The Yaka arrow in the MCU's cosmic context is a Ravager artifact with its own history and significance. The theory suggests it has some form of attunement, that it responds to emotional resonance as much as to the physical whistling technique. And Yondu's death created a space in the arrow that Kraglin filled with grief and love, and the specific weight of inheriting something from someone who meant everything to him. He's not just getting better at whistling, the arrow is learning him. Ned picks up Strange's sling ring during the film's events and opens portals on his first attempt. Multiple times, under pressure, without any instruction beyond think of where you want to go. The official reading is that this is played for comedy, the magic responding to beginner's luck, or the ring having been used enough by Strange that it's partially primed. The case for it is that Ned's immediate facility with the ring is a demonstration of a genuine, latent ability. Most people would not be able to do this. Even Strange's earliest portrayal showed him struggling with the most basic sling ring exercises. Ned's mind works in ways that are spatial, connective, and lateral. He thinks about networks and connections and how things fit together. This is established throughout his friendship with Peter, his interest in technology, his role as the guy in the chair. The theory is that this cognitive style is exactly what sorcery requires, and if Wong ever trained him, he would likely find a student who advanced at a genuinely unusual rate. The Grandmaster has been alive, apparently, for longer than most of the universe's notable beings. His brother, the Collector, is similarly ancient. Their longevity is never directly explained in the films. The theory is that the Grandmaster's arena, the contest of champions on Sakaar, isn't purely entertainment or even primarily entertainment. The scale of violence it generates, the number of deaths it processes, the energy produced by mortal beings fighting at peak capacity is being harvested, converted, used. This is the theory version of a fairly common mythological structure. The ruler who requires regular sacrifice to maintain their own vitality, applied to MCU cosmic architecture. The Grandmaster's joviality and his apparent indifference to the deaths in his arena make a different kind of sense if the deaths are sustaining him. Thanos' acquisition of the Power Stone from Xandar is referenced in Infinity War, but not shown. The Nova Corps, who secured the Power Stone at the end of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1, apparently fell to Thanos' forces with remarkable efficiency. The most powerful police military force in a large section of the galaxy, wiped out apparently without significant resistance. The Power Stone is powerful. Thanos is powerful. These are sufficient explanations on the surface. The theory is that Xandar's planetary defense systems, described in Guardians as specifically designed to contain and work with the Power Stone's energy, should have provided substantially more resistance than they apparently did. The only mechanism that explains the efficiency of the defeat is that someone with knowledge of those systems and their specific vulnerabilities provided that information to Thanos or his forces in advance. There's a traitor in the Nova Corps' history that the MCU has never identified, and whoever it was, the decision they made killed a planet. Doctor Strange is, by design, a character who holds information. The entire premise of his role in the MCU is that he looks ahead, sees what needs to happen, and then arranges circumstances toward that outcome without fully explaining himself to anyone. Which makes him fascinating to theorize about because Every choice he makes in the films carries the implication of knowledge we haven't been given. What else did he see across all those possible futures? What did he not tell Tony? What is he currently managing that no one else knows about? These theories live in the gaps between what Strange says and what Strange knows. This is the theory I find most compelling in this whole list, and the one I think the films support most directly. Strange, before giving Thanos the Time Stone, explicitly told Tony he would let Tony die rather than surrender the stone. He held that position throughout the entire Titan battle, and then with the battle apparently lost and Tony bleeding out, he changes his position. The usual reading is that Strange saw this was the last resort. The theory is more specific. He didn't give up the stone to save Tony. He gave up the stone because saving Tony was the entire point of the one winning timeline. Tony had to survive Titan. Tony had to live 5 more years. Tony had to be at the lake house on that specific morning when Scott Lang arrived. Tony had to be the one to solve the time travel. Tony had to be the one to snap. Strange had seen all 14 million outcomes. In the ones where Tony died on Titan, the winning scenario didn't exist. Not because Tony was the most powerful or the most important person alive, but because he was the specific person the universe needed in that specific moment. Strange surrendering the stone was him choosing Tony's life over the stone specifically because Tony's life was the one element the winning timeline couldn't lose. The "we're in the endgame now" is not resignation. It's confirmation that the sequence has started correctly. The Ancient One is described as having seen possible futures through her use of the Time Stone. Her management of Kamar-Taj is presented as careful and deeply informed. She knew about Dormammu. She anticipated Caecilius. She made decisions about who to train and who to turn away with a precision that suggests long-term planning rather than short-term management. The theory is that her influence extends well beyond Kamar-Taj. The people she chose to turn away or delay are as interesting as the people she trained. Her decision-making about which threats to address directly and which to leave to others, and specifically to which others, suggests she had a fairly detailed map of who was going to do what in the coming decades. She knew about Thanos. She knew about the stones. She knew, when she met the Hulk in 2012 during the time heist, exactly who he was and what his mission was. Her willingness to give him the Time Stone wasn't reluctant cooperation. It was a transaction she'd anticipated for years. Strange's official arc is about ego and humility, and learning to use his gifts in service of others, rather than himself. This is the stated theme, and it's accurately described. The theory is that the emotional engine underneath all of that is Christine. Every significant choice Strange makes can be traced back to either the loss of her, the hope of her, or the attempt to become someone deserving of her. His obsession with surgery before the accident was partly about success and status, but partly about being extraordinary enough that losing her wouldn't have happened. His turn toward the mystic arts was an escape from a loss he couldn't process. His eventual acceptance of his role as Sorcerer Supreme is partly about having found a version of himself she might actually recognize. The Multiverse of Madness makes this explicit. He meets multiple Christines in multiple universes, and none of them work out. But the theory is that this thread is present much earlier. Strange became the Sorcerer Supreme, partly because he was looking for a self worth loving. He just had to go through several multiverses to find out that the self was the destination, not the means. The mirror dimension is a parallel space that overlays the physical world but can't be affected by it. Strange uses it defensively and offensively throughout his appearances. The theory is that he also uses it for storage. Specifically, things he encounters in the course of his work as Sorcerer Supreme that he doesn't want S.H.I.E.L.D, the government, or anyone else to know about. Cosmic artifacts with unpredictable properties, entities that can't be safely killed, individuals who can't be safely imprisoned in conventional systems. Strange has the ability to access and maintain a secure dimensional space that no one can monitor without his cooperation. The mirror dimension, in this reading, is Strange's private containment facility. Whatever's in there is known only to him. Whatever decisions he's made about who and what goes in there are his alone. That's either very reassuring or deeply concerning, depending on how much you trust his judgment, and the MCU has consistently given you reasons to trust and not trust it in roughly equal measure. Mordo's fall, his decision that there are too many sorcerers, that the breaking of natural law must be corrected, is presented in the films as a consequence of learning that the Ancient One was breaking the rules she had dedicated her life to enforcing. His rigidity couldn't accommodate the hypocrisy. The theory is that she knew this would happen. She saw Mordo's future clearly enough to understand that his encounter with her truth would break him, and she chose to tell him anyway. Or rather, she arranged circumstances where he would inevitably find out. Because a Mordo who believes completely in the rules and then discovers they can be broken, and that the breaking of them can be weaponized against magic users, is, in the long run, a better guardian of the balance than a Mordo who never had his faith tested. Her version of preparing the world for what comes after her was to create the corrective. Mordo's crusade against sorcerers is, in the Ancient One's plan, a form of quality control that she couldn't perform herself because she was too invested in maintaining Karmatide's growth. Whether that plan is correct is another matter entirely, but it's very much the kind of long-horizon thinking that the Ancient One demonstrates throughout her appearances. The Illuminati in Multiverse of Madness are presented as authoritative and capable. They execute variants with apparent confidence. They have Wanda-level powers in their membership. Wanda of 838 was apparently powerful enough to be worth comparing to, and their headquarters is well-resourced and serious. The theory is that by the time our Strange arrives in their universe, the Illuminati is already in moral and operational decline. The willingness to execute variants, to kill people for what a version of them did elsewhere, is not the decision of a healthy institution. It's the decision of an institution that has started to believe its own authority supersedes the usual moral constraints. They were probably fine once. They probably started with genuinely good intentions and genuinely careful deliberation. But at the point we encounter them, they've been making decisions that have been corrupting their judgment for some time, and their encounter with 6116 Strange is less a functioning institution confronting a threat and more a declining one, making the last in a series of bad calls. Clea appears and tells Strange they need to deal with the incursion he's caused. The surface reading is that Strange's multiversal activities throughout the film created a new incursion event that they now have to address. The theory is that he's caused might be slightly misleading, that the incursion she's referring to was already developing before the events of Multiverse of Madness, and that Strange's actions during the film were in some cases responding to it rather than creating it. The multiverse damage left by Wanda's journey through 838, the cascade effects of the No Way Home spell, the general structural instability of the post-Endgame time stream. These are all contributing factors to a situation that Clea has been monitoring and that she came to recruit Strange to help with specifically because he's already involved. The incursion isn't his fault, exactly. He's just the person most embedded in the problem. The Darkhold doesn't corrupt its readers in the same way. It finds the specific vulnerability in each reader and works from there. Wanda's vulnerability was family, the children she'd lost, the version of her life she'd been denied. The Darkhold presented a path toward that specific thing, and she followed it. Mordo's vulnerability was order and rule. Strange's vulnerability is control and the compulsion to manage outcomes rather than accept them. This theory suggests the Darkhold is a significantly more sophisticated artifact than a simple evil book. It's personalized. It reads its reader before it begins. And the specific horror it produces is precisely calibrated to what each reader most deeply wants and most deeply fears losing, which means resisting it requires knowing yourself at a level that's actually quite difficult for most people. The Darkhold wins not through brute force but through accurate empathy. America's power throughout Multiverse of Madness is completely unreliable under stress and suddenly functional when the emotional conditions are right. Her final breakthrough comes not from training or technique, but from reaching a specific emotional state: rage, love, the protective instinct that overrides fear. The theory is that this isn't a temporary limitation she'll grow out of. It's the permanent architecture of her ability. She is a mutant, in the loosest sense of the MCU's emerging definitions, someone whose power is intrinsic rather than conferred, and whose power is also specifically tied to psychological states in ways that conventional training can only partially address. She won't become more powerful by learning to control her emotions. She'll become more powerful by learning to access the full spectrum of them deliberately, which is a different and considerably more interesting kind of training. Taking the previous theory a step further, among the outcomes Strange surveyed, he almost certainly saw versions where the Avengers won, but without the specific symbolic weight that Tony's death provided. Victories that were complete but smaller, that left fewer consequences for the people who survived them. What Strange actually did in this reading is select the winning timeline not just because it was winnable, but because it was the version where the victory transformed the people involved. A universe that wins because Tony Stark died is a universe that understands what the win cost. It's a universe where Sam Wilson knows exactly why he's Captain America, where Peter Parker understands the weight of responsibility in a way no spider bite could have taught him, where the loss is load-bearing for everything that comes after. Strange saw that, and he chose it. That's not just strategy, that's compassion, operating at cosmological scale. Here's where I always end up in these conversations: the cosmic end of the MCU, the Guardians, the Eternals, the Celestials, the scale of the universe beyond Earth and its immediate cosmic neighbourhood is the part that I find most genuinely interesting as a theoretical space. Because the MCU has seeded an enormous amount of cosmological world building that it hasn't fully developed, and the gap between what's been shown and what the mythology implies is where the richest theories live. So let's go properly out there for a bit. When Ego dies at the end of Guardians Volume 2, Peter loses the celestial power he briefly accessed. The film treats this as the cost of the victory. Peter gives up being a god to save his friends, and Ego's death removes the power source. Clean, finite. The theory is that it's not quite that clean. What Ego's death removed was the external power source, the live celestial feeding Peter's latent heritage and enabling its expression. The genetic heritage itself is still there. Peter is still, at a cellular level, the son of a celestial. The potential isn't gone, it's dormant. In extraordinary circumstances, but to emotional extremity, proximity to other cosmic-level power sources, a direct encounter with something that activates the heritage in the way Ego did, that dormancy could potentially shift. Peter doesn't know this. Nobody knows this, but the biology hasn't been retroactively changed by Ego's death. It's a quiet possibility sitting in the character's background that the MCU could activate when and if it chooses to. Guardians Volume 3 gives us the full origin of Rocket's augmentations, the High Evolutionaries program, the lab, the other animals who became his family. It's a heartbreaking story, and it accounts for most of what makes Rocket who he is. What the theory proposes is that not all of his augmentations are the High Evolutionaries' work. Some components in Rocket's system are older, of a different technological signature, and not consistent with the High Evolutionaries' known methodology. The implication is that Rocket was captured and modified before the events Volume 3 depicts by someone else for different purposes, and that his memories of this period were either suppressed or never clearly formed. This is less a theory about who that someone was and more a theory about what it means for Rocket's character. He's built an identity around being the product of the High Evolutionary's cruelty. The theory suggests he might also be the product of cruelties he's never been able to name or account for, which is a layer of trauma on top of the one he's already processed. The collector's collection was extraordinary and ancient and not entirely catalogued. The case goes like this. Among his exhibits was at least one object that predated the current cosmic cycle, something from the universe that existed before the Big Bang of the current one. The kind of artifact that would have survived the transition between cosmological states because it was built to survive exactly that. When Thanos destroyed the Collector's facility to retrieve the Reality Stone, that artifact, whatever it was released. Not destroyed, released into the background radiation of the current universe, where it's been drifting since the events of Infinity War. What it is, what it does, and who finds it first are questions the MCU hasn't answered, but the existence of pre-cosmic objects in the MCU's mythology is consistent with what we know about the Infinity Stones and their connection to the universe before the Big Bang. The Collector knew more than he said. "I am Groot" is expressed as a single repeated phrase. This is well established as the thing Groot says, and it's consistently played for comedy and charm. He's adorable and loyal, and occasionally heroic, and clearly limited in his communication range. The theory is that this reading is profoundly wrong. The Groot language isn't a single phrase with a single meaning. It's a full language with complete grammar, nuance, emotional register, and philosophical depth that virtually no other species in the MCU is equipped to process. The fact that Rocket understands him is remarkable. Rocket is, by implication, one of only a handful of beings in the universe who has learned Groot's language rather than simply hearing a repeated sound. What Groot says in every scene he's in is fully articulate. He's commenting, observing, joking, arguing, declaring things of considerable weight. The tragedy is that he's surrounded by beings who hear, "I am Groot," and understand the emotional content without ever accessing what he's actually saying. He is, in this reading, the MCU's most isolated genius, and one of its most patient ones. Thanos' stated motivation is resources, preventing civilizations from consuming themselves through overpopulation and resource depletion. This is the official framing, and it's what Thanos himself believes. The theory is that he also knew about the Celestials. The emergence events on seeded planets produce Celestials, but require the death of every living thing on the host planet. Earth alone contained billions of souls, whose deaths would have powered the emergence imminently. Several other planets in the MCU's galaxy were presumably in similar positions. Thanos' snap, by halving the population of those planets, delayed their emergences. Not forever, but significantly. Billions of deaths on a planet trigger an emergence. Half as many people, generating half as much psychic energy, generates half the power. And the emergence requires a threshold that Earth, post-snap, no longer met. This makes Thanos, in an extremely dark way, partially right about a much larger threat that the snap incidentally addressed. He solved several problems with one act, including ones he may not have fully articulated even to himself. The Eternals ends with Arishem capturing Cersei and others, and announcing he will return to judge humanity based on the memories of the Eternals and whether humanity's evolution justifies its continued existence. The theory is that judge is the wrong word for what he's actually doing. Celestials don't have the kind of judicial ethics framework that implies a genuine possibility of acquittal. Humanity continues to exist, or it doesn't, based on its utility to the Celestials' program. The Eternals' memories are data about what humanity has produced. The ideas, the art, the individuals, the social structures. The Celestials are deciding whether the species they seeded has generated enough that it's worth preserving a sample of for the next cosmic cycle. Arishem isn't a judge. He's an archivist deciding what to keep. That's, if anything, more unsettling than a trial. When Thanos uses the Infinity Stones in Infinity War to destroy themselves, the implication is that they're simply gone. This is presented as the hero's greatest defeat, not just the snap, but the removal of the mechanism to reverse it. The theory is that annihilation of an object that contains fundamental forces of the universe isn't really possible. The Power Stone is power. The Reality Stone is reality. You can't unmake those things. You can only change what form they're expressed in. Thanos converted the stones from their condensed, accessible forms back into the base cosmic energy they represent. That energy is now diffuse, scattered, and not accessible in the same way the concentrated stones were. But it's not gone. It's reforming slowly over cosmic time, or it's already reforming somewhere in the universe in ways that nobody has yet noticed or documented. The post-Endgame MCU has occasionally gestured at residual stone effects. The theory suggests that's not residual. That's early reconstitution. The quantum realm is described primarily as a subatomic dimension that can be used for time travel. Scott Lang's accidental time displacement in Ant-Man and the Wasp leads to the time heist that saves the universe. This is its primary narrative function. The theory is that the quantum realm is significantly larger in scope than its functional use in the MCU suggests. Below the Planck scale, at the depths of the quantum realm, are remnants of universes that have ended. Compressed, reduced to fundamental geometry, but structurally present. The quantum realm is, in this reading, the MCU's equivalent of a palimpsest. Every cosmic cycle's leftovers layered on top of each other at scales too small to easily perceive. Everything the TVA thought was erased by pruning is in some form there. The multiversal diversity that He Who Remains spent centuries suppressing didn't disappear. It was compressed into quantum substrate. It was always waiting. The Sovereign created Adam Warlock in response to being humiliated by the Guardians. This is the stated motivation, but the Sovereign are an ancient, highly advanced species who've had millennia to observe the Celestials and their emergence program. The theory is that their obsession with genetic perfection isn't vanity. It's a specific arms race. They know about the emergencies. They know what a Celestial is and what it costs a planet to produce one. And their genetic engineering program, which produced Adam Warlock as its current pinnacle, was oriented from the beginning toward producing a being capable of interacting with or opposing celestial-level threats. Not just being perfect in the abstract, being perfect in a specifically useful direction. Adam Warlock's role in Guardians Volume 3 is mostly a transitional one. He's introduced, he develops, he ends up on the right side. But the theory is that his actual purpose in the MCU's longer narrative hasn't been activated yet. He was made for something specific. One of the persistent puzzles of Endgame's ending is the mechanics of Steve Rogers' choice to stay in the past. The film presents this as creating a branch timeline that an old Steve emerges from, sitting on a bench at the exact right moment for Sam Wilson to receive the shield. The logistics of how old Steve is sitting on that bench in the main timeline when he should have aged in a branch have never been cleanly explained. The theory is that Steve, after living his life with Peggy in the branch timeline, used the quantum realm to navigate back. Not to change anything, not to return to active duty, but to be present at that specific moment, to hand the shield to Sam in person, because he knew, from the same time travel mechanics he'd used once before, exactly when and where he needed to be. The bench isn't Steve arriving from an uncertain past, it's Steve arriving from a complete life, through the mechanism he knew existed, to finish what he started. He had one last mission. He gave himself to it. We're in the home stretch, 10 theories left. And honestly, these are the ones that I tend to come back to on a rewatch. Not because they're the most spectacular on the list, but because they're the kind of thing that quietly changes the texture of a film once the idea is in your head. You can't quite unsee them. They just sit there, on subsequent viewings, a slightly different colour than they were before. The snap removed half of all life for 5 years. Then Bruce's snap in Endgame brought everyone back. The official framing is that this is a reversal. Traumatic, complicated socially and personally, but ultimately an undoing of the original event. The theory is that 5 years is not reversible in any meaningful sense. Civilizations don't undo 5 years. You don't uninherit property. You don't unelect governments. You don't ungrieve. The economic systems, the legal frameworks, the social contracts that developed in the 5-year period, all of these persisted after the return. The people who came back into a world that had adapted to their absence, and the adaptation didn't unadapt just because they were back. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier addressed this most directly. The displacement populations, the political movements, the instability. But the full scope of what the 5-year period permanently changed in the MCU's world hasn't been examined. The theory is that the MCU's current world is not a restored version of the pre-snap world. It's a completely different world, built on the wreckage of 2 seismic events that happens to have the same people in it. Already touched on this in the Hulk's snap in Endgame, involved an entirely different energy expression than Thanos' original snap. Thanos used the stones at the height of their power in their original configuration. Bruce used them in Tony's rebuilt configuration, with a body that processes gamma radiation rather than being destroyed by it, and with the express purpose of undoing a specific action rather than performing a new one. The theory is that the reversal snap wasn't a perfect inverse of the original. It was a close approximation, performed under significantly different conditions. The people who came back slightly different, not dramatically, not obviously, but at a cellular level. The precision of the original snap's deanimation couldn't be perfectly matched by a reversal performed under emergency conditions by a different being with different biology. Monica Rambeau's development of powers after passing through Wanda's hex is partly explained by this. Her body had already been prepared, at a subtle level, by the slightly imperfect reversal. The hex's energy found purchase in a physiology that was already altered. The shield is a symbol. That's the explicit narrative of the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Sam's journey to accepting it is about understanding what it represents and what he'll be required to represent with it. The theory is that the shield also carries a technical burden, that every government intelligence operation that tracked Steve Rogers as Captain America is now tracking Sam Wilson as Captain America. Not just American agencies, everyone who had Steve under observation. And Steve, who lived with that surveillance for years and learned to navigate around it, never briefed Sam on its specifics. Sam is learning in real time what it costs to carry that identity in a world where everyone with sufficient resources wants to know what Captain America's doing, where he's going, and what he knows. Steve had decades of experience managing that. Sam has the symbol and no intelligence briefing. The standard reading of Clint's Ronin period, the years between the snap and Endgame, where he operated as a ruthless assassin targeting criminal organizations, is grief. He lost his family. He had no way to fix it. He directed the rage and loss at whoever was still alive that he felt deserved it. The theory is that there was more method to it than that. Clint is a S.H.I.E.L.D. operative of decades' experience. His targeting of criminal organizations during the Ronin years was too specific, too geographically consistent, and too operationally effective to be purely emotional. He had a list, he had intelligence, he was working through something systematic. The specific organizations he targeted were the ones that had been expanding into the vacuum left by the snap, the ones that would have become permanent fixtures of a post-blip criminal landscape if left alone. Clint was, in a sense, maintaining a kind of brutal stability in the 5-year world. Not because he cared about that stability, but because he had nothing else to do, and his hands needed work. When the 2014 nebula and the 2023 nebula's cybernetics sync and create an awareness link between them, this creates a temporal paradox of a fairly extreme kind. Two versions of the same being, in the same place, with shared consciousness temporarily, existing simultaneously. The standard paradox rules would suggest this should be deeply destabilizing at minimum. It isn't. The 2023 nebula continues to function. The 2014 nebula takes advantage of the link, and the universe doesn't implode. The theory is that the Soul Stone specifically absorbed the paradox, that its role as a soul-containing mechanism extended to managing the conflict between two versions of the same soul occupying the same space. The Soul Stone has preferences about soul integrity, and it quietly smoothed over something that should have created a much bigger problem, which would mean the Soul Stone was, in some sense, actively participating in the events of Endgame in ways that nobody was tracking. There's a moment in WandaVision where Monica Rambeau passes through the Hex barrier and comes out changed. The in-universe explanation is Wanda's chaos magic, rewriting her biology. But there's a quieter theory underneath that one, which is that Monica's body was already primed for alteration, that the blip had left a door slightly ajar in her cellular architecture before she ever approached Westview. 5 years in the soul world, or whatever compressed state the snapped individuals existed in, is not 5 years of ordinary biological pause. A system designed to suspend life doesn't perfectly restore it, the way you might restart a computer. There's a residue. The cells that came back having been somewhere else in a way that left traces in the cellular structure, subtle, undetectable, without specific instruments, but real, which means every person who returned from the blip is, at a microscopic level, not quite the same person who left. The MCU has scattered clues across its Phase 4 entries that blip survivors and non-survivors respond differently to certain events. It's usually explained as psychological: the trauma of disappearance, the adjustment of return, the social and emotional damage of 5 years of absence. But the theory is that the difference is also physical, and that the MCU hasn't yet fully shown its hand on what that means for the people involved. Monica's powers might be the first visible expression of something that's latent in every single returned individual. Natasha's sacrifice for the Soul Stone in Endgame mirrors Gamora's sacrifice in Infinity War. A soul for a soul. What this means for where Natasha exists after her death is left unaddressed, and pointedly unaddressed in a way that the film seems deliberately uncomfortable with. The theory is that Natasha's soul was claimed by the Soul Stone in the same way Gamora's was, absorbed into the stone's internal world, the soul world. When Tony snapped in Endgame, he destroyed Thanos and his army, but the mechanism of the snap also involved the Infinity Stones at full power. What happened to the souls inside the Soul Stone during that event is genuinely unclear. Whether Natasha is restored by the Hulk snap, whether she's affected by Tony's, whether she's simply beyond recovery, the films don't address it. The one clean answer is that Black Widow's death was treated as permanent by the surviving Avengers, and no one attempted to retrieve her soul from the stone the way Gamora was eventually retrieved from it. Whether that means retrieval wasn't possible, or simply that nobody thought to try, is a question the MCU has left open. The shot of Thanos smiling at the end of the Avengers, after learning about the failed Chitauri invasion and the Avengers who defeated it, is a brief post-credits stinger designed to excite comic book fans who recognise the purple chin. At the time, most audiences took it as a tease. Here's the big bad coming eventually. The theory is that from that moment forward, Thanos was actively studying the Avengers, not planning to fight them, planning around them. The 6 years between the Avengers and Infinity War were 6 years of Thanos building a complete operational picture of Earth's defenders. Their capabilities, their weaknesses, their interpersonal dynamics, their emotional pressure points. His attacks in Infinity War are extraordinarily precisely targeted. He goes for the Space Stone when it's most isolated. He takes Gamora at the moment she thinks they're safe. He arrives at Wakanda at the exact moment when Vision is most vulnerable. That precision doesn't come from underestimating his opponents. It comes from knowing them extremely well. The Avengers spent 6 years building themselves into a team. Thanos spent 6 years building a complete intelligence dossier on the team they were building. Everything the MCU has done since Endgame involves the multiverse in some way. The Loki series, No Way Home, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, What If, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, the Kang question. All of it points toward the same structural problem. The barriers between universes are becoming unstable. The theory is that the specific event that began this destabilization was the Endgame